Designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on social media and wherever you listen to podcasts. Our current goal is to get to 100 written reviews on the podcast app to help new listeners find us. If you haven't subscribed and written a review yet, please do. We get closer to our goal every week. Your reviews continue to amaze us, and we learn from your feedback as well. So thank you for taking the time to share. This episode is supported by Stone Masonry. Tonight, we'll read the opening to Afloat and Ashore, a nautical fiction novel by James Fenimore Cooper, published in 1844. Set at the turn of the 19th century, the novel follows the maritime adventures of Miles Wallingford, Jr., the son of wealthy New York landowners who chooses to go to sea after the death of his parents. The novel is partially autobiographical, in part by Cooper's own experiences as a sailor. Throughout his career, Cooper wrote profusely, with the objective of countering European prejudices and nurturing an original American art and culture. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Afloat and Ashore, Chapter 1. I was born in a valley not very remote from the sea. My father had been a sailor in youth, and some of my earliest recollections are connected with the history of his adventures and the recollections they excited. He had been a boy in the War of the Revolution and had seen some service in the shipping of that period. Among other scenes he witnessed, he had been on board the Trumbull in her action with the Watt, the hardest fought naval combat of that war, and he particularly delighted in relating its incidents. He had been wounded in the battle and bore the marks of the injury in a scar that slightly disfigured a face that, without this blemish, would have been singularly handsome. My mother, after my poor father's death, always spoke of even this scar as a beauty spot. Agreeably to my own recollections, the mark scarcely deserved that commendation, as it gave one side of the face a grim and fierce appearance, particularly when its owner was displeased. My father died on the farm on which he was born, and which descended to him from his great-grandfather, an English emigrant that had purchased it of the Dutch colonist who had originally cleared it from the woods. The place was called Clawbunny, which some said was good Dutch, others bad Dutch, and now and then a person ventured a conjecture that it might be Indian. Bonny it was, in one sense at least, for a lovelier farm there is not on the whole of the wide surface of the Empire State. What does not always happen in this wicked world, it was as good as it was handsome. It consisted of 372 acres of first-rate land, either arable or of rich river bottom in meadows, and of more than 100 of rocky mountainside that was very tolerably covered with wood. The first of our family who owned the place had built a substantial one-story stone house that bears the date of 1707 on one of its gables, and to which each of his successors had added a little, until the whole structure got to resemble a cluster of cottages thrown together without the least attention to order or regularity. There were a porch, a front door, and a lawn, however, the latter containing 6 acres of a soil as black as one's hat, and nourishing 8 or 10 elms that were scattered about, as if their seeds had been sown broadcast. In addition to the trees, and a suitable garniture of shrubbery, this lawn was coated with a sward that, in the proper seasons, rivaled all I have read or imagined of the emerald and shorn slopes of the Swiss valleys. Clawbunny, while it had all the appearance of being a residence of an affluent agriculturalist, had none of the pretension of these later times. The house had an air of substantial comfort without, an appearance that its interior in no manner contradicted. The ceilings were low, it is true, nor were the rooms particularly large, but the latter were warm in winter, cool in summer, and tidy, neat, and respectable all the year round. Both the parlors had carpets, as had the passages and all the better bedrooms, and there were an old-fashioned chintz settee, well stuffed and cushioned, and curtains in the big parlor, as we called the best apartment, the pretending name of a drawing room, not having reached our valley as far back as the year 1796, or that in which my recollections of the place, as it then existed, are the most vivid and distinct. We had orchards, meadows, and plowed fields all around us, while the barns, granaries, sties, and other buildings of the farm were of solid stone, like the dwelling, and all in capital condition. In addition to the place, which he inherited from my grandfather, quite without any encumbrance, well stocked and supplied with utensils of all sorts, my father had managed to bring with him from sea some $14,000 or $15,000, which he carefully invested in mortgages in the county. He got 2,700 pounds currency with my mother, similarly bestowed, and 2 or 3 great landed proprietors, and as many retired merchants from York accepted. Captain Wallingford was generally supposed to be one of the stiffest men in Ulster County. I do not know exactly how true was this report, though I never saw anything but the abundance of a better sort of American farm under the paternal roof, and I know that the poor were never sent away empty-handed. It is true that our wine was made of currants, but it was delicious, and there was always a sufficient stock in the cellar to enable us to drink it 3 or 4 years old. My father, however, had a small private collection of his own, out of which he would occasionally produce a bottle, and I remember to have heard Governor George Clinton, afterwards Vice President, who was an Ulster County man, and who sometimes stopped at Clawbunny in passing, say that it was excellent East India Madeira. As for clarets, Burgundy, hock, and champagne, they were wine then unknown in America, except on the tables of some of the principal merchants, and, here and there, on that of some travelled gentleman of an estate larger than common. When I say that Governor George Clinton used to stop occasionally and taste my father's Madeira, I do not wish to boast of being classed with those who then composed the gentry of the state. To this, in that day, we could hardly aspire, though the substantial hereditary property of my family gave us a local consideration that placed us a good deal above the station of ordinary yeomen. Had we lived in one of the large towns, our association would unquestionably have been with those who are usually considered to be 1 or 2 degrees beneath the highest class. These distinctions were much more marked immediately after the War of the Revolution than they are today, and they are more marked today even than all but the most lucky or the most meritorious, whichever fortune dignifies, are willing to allow. The courtship between my parents occurred while my father was at home, to be cured of the wounds he had received in the engagement between the Trumbull and the Watt. I have always supposed this was the moving cause why my mother fancied that the grim-looking scar on the left side of my father's face was so particularly becoming. The battle was fought in June 1780, and my parents were married in the autumn of the same year. My father did not go to sea again until after my birth, which took place the very day that Cornwallis capitulated at Yorktown. These combined events set the young sailor in motion, for he felt he had a family to provide for, and he wished to make one more mark on the enemy in return for the beauty spot his wife so gloried in. He accordingly got a commission in a privateer, made 2 or 3 fortunate cruises, and was able at the peace to purchase a prize brig, which he sailed as master and owner until the year 1790, when he was recalled to the paternal roof by the death of my grandfather. Being an only son, the captain, as my father was uniformly called, inherited the land, stock, utensils, and crops, as already mentioned, while the 6,000 pounds currency that were at use went to my 2 aunts, who were thought to be well married to men in their own class of life in adjacent counties. My father never went to sea after he inherited Clawbunny. From that time down to the day of his death, he remained on his farm, with the exception of a single winter passed in Albany as one of the representatives of the county. In his day, it was a credit to the man to represent a county and to hold office under the state, though the abuse of the elective principle, not to say of the appointing power, has since brought about so great a change. Then, a member of Congress was somebody. Now, he is only a member of Congress. We were but 2 surviving children, 3 of the family dying infants, leaving only my sister Grace and myself to console our mother in her widowhood. The dire accident which placed her in this, the saddest of all conditions for a woman who had been a happy wife, occurred in the year 1794, when I was in my 13th year and Grace was just turned 11. It may be well to relate the particulars. There was a mill just where the stream that runs through our valley tumbles down to a level below that on which the farm lies, and empties itself into a small tributary of the Hudson. This mill was on our property, and was a source of great convenience and of some profit to my father. There he ground all the grain that was consumed for domestic purposes for several miles around, and the tolls enabled him to fatten his porkers and beeves in a way to give both a sort of established character. In a word, the mill was the concentrating point for all the products of the farm, there being a little landing on the margin of the creek that put up from the Hudson, whence a sloop sailed weekly for town. My father passed half his time about the mill and landing, superintending his workmen, and particularly giving directions about the fitting of the sloop, which was his property also, and about the gear of the mill. He was clever, certainly, and had made several useful suggestions to the millwright, who occasionally came to examine and repair the works. But he was by no means so accurate a mechanic as he fancied himself to be. He had invented some new mode of arresting the movement and of setting the machinery in motion when necessary. What it was, I never knew, for it was not named at Clawbunny after the fatal accident occurred. One day, however, in order to convince the millwright of the excellence of this improvement, my father caused the machinery to be stopped, and then placed his own weight upon the large wheel in order to manifest the sense he felt in the security of his invention. He was in the very act of laughing exultatedly at the manner in which the millwright shook his head at the risk he ran, when the arresting power lost its control of the machinery. The heavy head of water burst into the buckets, and the wheel whirled round, carrying my unfortunate father with it. This was the first serious sorrow of my life. I had always regarded my father as one of the fixtures of the world, as a part of the great system of the universe, and had never contemplated his death as a possible thing. That another revolution might occur and carry the country back under the dominion of the British Crown would have seemed to me far more possible than that my father could die. Bitter truth now convinced me of the fallacy of such notions. It was months and months before I ceased to dream of this frightful scene. At my age, all the feelings were fresh and plastic, and grief took strong hold of my heart. Grace and I used to look at each other without speaking, long after the event, the tears starting to my eyes and rolling down her cheeks, our emotions being the only communications between us, but communications that no uttered words could have made so plain. Even now, I allude to my mother's anguish with trembling. She was sent for to the house of the miller where the body lay, and arrived unapprised of the extent of the scene. Never can I, never shall I forget the outbreakings of her sorrow when she learned the whole of the situation. She was in fainting fits for hours, one succeeding another, and then her grief found tongue. There was no term of endearment that the heart of woman could dictate to her speech that was not lavished on the lifeless clay. Time soothed our sorrows, though my mother, a woman of more than common sensibility, or, it was better to say, of uncommon affections, never entirely recovered from the effects of her irreparable loss. She had loved too well, too devotedly, too engrossingly, ever to think of a second marriage, and lived only to care for the interest of Miles Wallingford's children. I firmly believe we were more beloved because we stood in this relation to the deceased than because we were her own natural offspring. Her health became gradually undermined, and 3 years after the accident of the mill, Mr. Harding laid her at my father's side. I was now 16, and can better describe what passed during the last days of her existence than what took place at the death of her husband. Grace and I were apprised of what was so likely to occur quite a month before the fatal moment arrived, and we were not so much overwhelmed with sudden grief as we had been on the first great occasion of family sorrow, though we both felt our loss keenly, and my sister, I think I may almost say, inextinguishably. Mr. Harding had us both brought to the bedside to listen to the parting advice of our dying parent, and to be impressed with a scene that is always healthy if rightly improved. You baptized these 2 dear children, good Mr. Harding, and I now ask of your friendship and pastoral care to see that they are not neglected at the most critical period of their lives, that when impressions are the deepest and yet the most easily made, God will reward all your kindness to the orphan children of your friends. The excellent divine, a man who lived more for others than for himself, made the required promises, and the soul of my mother took its flight in peace. Neither my sister nor myself grieved as deeply for the loss of this last of our parents as we did for that of the first. We had both seen so many instances of her devout goodness, had been witnesses of so great a triumph of her faith as to feel an intimate, though silent, persuasion that her death was merely a passage to a better state of existence, that it seemed selfish to regret. Still, we wept and mourned, even while, in one sense, I think we rejoiced. She was relieved from much bodily suffering, and I remember when I went to take a last look at her beloved face, that I gazed on its calm serenity with a feeling akin to exaltation, as I recollected that pain could no longer exercise dominion over her frame, and that her spirit was dwelling in bliss. After the death of my father, I had never bethought me of the manner in which he had disposed of his property. I heard something said of his will, and gleaned a little, accidentally, of the forms that had been gone through in proving the instrument and of obtaining its probate. Shortly after my mother's death, however, Mr. Harding had a free conversation with both me and Grace on the subject, when we learned, for the first time, the disposition that had been made. My father had bequeathed to me the farm, mill, landing, sloop, stock, utensils, crops, etc., etc., in full property, subject, however, to my mother's use of the whole until I attained my majority, after which I was to give her complete possession of a comfortable wing of the house, which had every convenience for a small family within itself, certain privileges in the fields, dairy, styes, orchards, meadows, granaries, etc., and to pay her 300 pounds currency. Grace had 4,000 pounds that were at use, and I had all the remainder of the personal property, which yielded about $500 a year, as the farm, sloop, mill, landing, etc., produced a net annual income of rather more than $1,000, besides all that was consumed in housekeeping. I was very well off in the way of temporal things for one who had been trained in habits as simple as those which reign